Hello, hello. We are live. Welcome, welcome. You have joined us for the next in the CTO Craft Community Bytes series, and we're going to be talking about psychological safety in the remote team setup, which no doubt we're all still knee deep in. I don't think we've gone completely RTO since coming back from COVID, for better or for worse. For anyone here who's not a member already, CTO Craft basically is a community for anyone who's in any kind of senior technology leadership role. We've got a Slack group, we've got conferences, we've got a newsletter, etc., etc. So if you're not a member already, go along to ctocraft.com, leave us your details, we'll get you added. One thing I'd like to say very quickly, we've got a CTO Craft compensation survey happening at the moment where we're gathering data from all of the members and lots of our friends from outside the community around what they're currently being paid, what long-term incentives they have, and so on. If you would like to get involved with that, please do. The more data that we have on that, the better the report is going to be. I'll leave a link in the chat. Before we get going, just a reminder, we do have a Q&A section on the side. If you'd like to ask a question, have it pop up for the panelists, click on the little question mark in a speech bubble that's on the far right, not that far right, and you can leave anything that you would like to ask. But let's crack on. Okay, some quick introductions. We'll start with James. So James is a people-focused CTO and technology advisor, and he's built teams across the UK, the US, South Africa, and India. And he has a particular interest in the human systems that shape how distributed teams operate. Welcome, James. We also have Sarah Persov, who's a senior software engineer at Dojo, and she's a women in tech advocate. She has a practical people-first perspective on psychological safety, leadership, and how teams actually experience work. Hi, Sarah. And finally, we have Michelle McDade. She's an experienced engineering leader and founder of The Leading Place, which helps organizations reimagine leadership and build workplaces where both people and performance thrive. Welcome, Michelle. Okay, well, let's jump straight into things. I mean, I think a good place to start would be to kind of define what we mean by psychological safety, regardless of the context. So maybe let's start with Michelle. I mean, how do you recognize psychological safety? What defines it, I suppose, for you?
Yeah, I would go by what Amy Edmondson says about psychological safety. She discovered it when she was researching errors in teams, and she actually expected the highest performing teams, to be the ones that made the least mistakes, but it was the opposite because they felt safe to admit them. So it's really where people on a team feel safe to share ideas, to challenge, to speak up, and just be themselves within a team. That's what I would say.
Yeah. So there's an element of lacking that fear of failure that you get in some teams.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How about you, Sarah? What are some aspects that you
I think
recognise?
I think for me, psychological safety in many ways is the same as Michelle's, but there's the added element of the different layers of it. You need to have psychological safety within your team, within your direct manager, but also as you go up the chain, there needs to be like that macro psychological safety. If you have trust with your manager, but you don't have trust with the company as a whole, then that can only go so far. And for me, it's really to do with the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's not just about making mistakes, but it's about being able to be vulnerable, being able to be honest, being open. And that's both with who you are as a person and your work, because they're intrinsically linked.
Yeah, for sure. James, and can you think of a situation where psychological safety has been notably absent, and were you able to recognise that?
Yes. I mean, I think the only thing I would add to the definitions is it's not necessarily about kind of everyone being nice all the time.
Mhm.
it helps to be nice. It always helps to be nice, but that's not necessarily what it's about. I think I kind of preface what I say with almost a recognition and an admission, I think, from my side, that I've never personally, I think, felt psychologically unsafe. But I think a lot of that stems from being, for want of a better phrase, a white male in a very white male dominated industry. So I think me feeling unsafe, I think, is something that I'm not necessarily positioned to talk accurately about. But I've definitely seen teams of mine and teams that I've been involved in that where that safety hasn't really been there. You notice the quieter people on the team. You notice people who, you could be in a one-on-one with them and they'll have lots of different things that they want to say and thoughts that they've had on things that have happened recently that they may air to you. But then you get into a group setting and none of that comes out. So yeah, I've definitely seen teams where certain individuals don't feel as safe as others. Yeah.
That's interesting, though, what you say, James, that you've never felt unsafe. I would say that I've seen it so many times, and I think it can be within, like, if it's in a larger group, you sometimes think, well, this is quite political. I need to be careful what I say here. And I would say that probably is experienced by any gender, but if, depending on the size of the group, or it's also even the way that people respond. I heard somebody talk recently about an all hands, where some people challenged something, and the way that the leaders responded wasn't very respectful. So that's not going to push people to share a view that may not go against, or that might go against the main thinking. So I think it's yeah, like, I think also silence. Often people think no one objected, but silence doesn't tell you that people agree.
I would also say that I think something that can be really hard is that a lot of people won't necessarily realize they're not feeling safe. I think, especially in the kind of capitalist society that we are in, the kind of work hustle culture, right? It's really easy to just think, well, this is just how everyone feels, or well, this is just what it's like working now, not having that psychological safety. But people don't necessarily call it psychological safety. It's the symptoms without the name. And I think that's really evident in feedback, in being able to be honest with all levels of management about mistakes, about, in a post-mortem, even feedback. I think a huge one is when you do things like feedback cycles, are you being honest in your feedback about your colleagues, your superiors, yourself, or do you not feel safe to be honest? And I agree that that doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity, race, gender. On the flip side, there is, of course, um, more of an emphasis at times for minorities, but I think it can be dangerous to kind of diminish that those issues that you may have faced just because you're a white man.
For sure. I think maybe defining that the term of psychological safety as, I guess, having that lack of fear of personal consequences, or the confidence to be able to say the truth without consequences. I guess my perception of my own interactions with people in teams is I have never really had that fear of speaking up, and that maybe that's not necessarily a white male thing in as such, but my personality is I'll say what I think and so be it, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But I think you said there about feedback cycles as well. I think that's something that is so often done badly, and it is something that feeds into people not feeling psychologically safe. And we can definitely go into that if that's a topic we want to explore.
And James, what you said about nice, I think that is a misconception, that actually psychological safety is not equals to comfort. It's actually hard to create and it can lead to challenging conversations. But like if you know something that's going to help someone to be better and you don't share it, that's you're robbing them of an opportunity to get promoted or to have a new, to be better in their role. So I think there's some people who kind of think, oh, it's just a luxury. Psychological safety is like so vital and fundamental, and trust in teams. You can't get to innovation if you don't have psychological safety. People are not going to be able to take risks and share ideas if they feel that they will be punished if it's not what is the right answer.
I think the higher, high risk, high reward type companies where there has to be high performance or high risk in general, though it's critical to have that psychological safety there. People are putting a bit of themselves into whatever they're doing. And if they're going above and beyond, they're working late, they're working weekends, they're, jumping on for an incident at 3 a.m, they need to believe and trust that it's going to be acknowledged, it's going to be rewarded, but also that things can go wrong. If people are too scared to suggest a bad idea, or there's not even a bad idea, but to suggest an idea where it's not the right approach or it's not the right avenue, or they try something out and it goes wrong, they need to know that that's not going to come back to bite them and that it's a learning experience. And I think that's particularly true with remote or hybrid, because people don't see the work you do as much. When you're in the office, people chat, people have coffee, you'll have a problem, to people, hey, do you have any ideas? Actually put that effort into reaching out to people, and you have to put that effort into showcase your work. Oh, hello?
Sorry, Sarah. I think we possibly lost you just for a couple of seconds there.
Oh, sorry.
I think
I don't know
you
where
did catch up with yourself, though.
I think we got
fantastic.
And actually,
I think,
can I just add something to that? What you were talking about when you're working remotely and it's less visible. I came across research which showed that when remote work is seen as more traceable and more serious. So often people in an office, if you go into the office, there's an expectation that people are going to be connecting with each other and having a chat. And there's a feeling with people who are working remotely that they need to be a bit more careful about their time, and they need to make sure that they can actually, it's traceable, it must be more efficient. So there's a less likelihood that people working remotely will chat with people that aren't part of their day-to-day getting their work done. And that can rob them of opportunities for visibility, but also sharing ideas and hearing about what's happening in other parts of the organization. So it's really important as leaders to flag that this is actually expected. We do expect you to spend time when you're chatting to other people, and actually every minute does not have to be accounted for, because you're going to end up losing and people will be more siloed as well.
I mean, in my office, we have a foosball table and like a PS5 or something, and couches and, multiple places to get coffee, and we're expected to use them. I mean, I'm only in the office 1 day a week, but most people are in 4 days a week. And the amount of work that I get done when I'm in the office is noticeably less or different. I'm not going to say less, I'm going to say different than when I'm working from home, because there's way more distractions. People want to go and have a catch up, find out about how your life is. And I think a big part of that is that you're treated more as a holistic person. You're not just a worker to perform, you are a whole. And I think in terms of building those connections, especially with your manager, when you're remote, it takes a lot more effort from both sides. And we all know that when you do have a better relationship, when you do have the type of relationship where your manager knows who you are, they know what's going on in your life, they know the stresses and all of that, they do accommodate that better because they know about it. But you have to put yourself in a very vulnerable position to open up to somebody online over, a video call, especially if you've never met them in person and you don't have that kind of connection that you might get in person.
Yeah, you have to be a lot more intentional about building the relationships and those feedback mechanisms for positives and negatives, for work stuff, for social stuff, for anything that us as humans need to do to build those bonds. You need to be a lot more intentional with them. Whether that's the bare minimum, I think, is one-on-ones these days, having weekly checkpoints to talk to everyone on the team, and that doesn't just mean the manager to each individual. That's the manager to the individual, and then each individual having touch points to be able to catch up, and making space for the non-work talk as well. I think one of you said it, just having the understanding that it's okay at the beginning of a call to spend 5 to 10 minutes just catching up about what happened over the weekend, or plans you've got coming up, or anything else. Not turn up to the meeting, you've got an agenda, get straight to business, deal with what's on the list, and then say goodbye and move on to the next thing.
And James, somebody actually in my research, one of the tech leaders said to me that he worked in a remote first org, and he also worked in a fully in-person org. And the people kept saying, well, we're much better when we're in person, for relationships. But actually, he said that in the remote first org, they always made time for what are you doing for the weekend? And then in a meeting the following week, they'll say, how did you get on at that wedding or whatever? And in the other org, nobody actually gave two tosses about what you were doing in your life. So he was like, it is also about the culture and about, I love the concept of the leadership shadow, but what you say, how you act, what you measure, what you reward. And you can say all you like about we're all about the whole person here, and we're whatever you say, but if you don't back that up in your actions, and if you actually show that, look, we don't actually have time to hear about anything that's going on in your life, that people know that.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, when people start to feel like a cog in a machine and not the whole person, as Sarah said.
Yeah, I think that's you're quite literally a three-dimensional person when you're meeting with someone face to face, and that includes all the informal stuff that you don't necessarily find time for, or there isn't necessarily a specific channel for when you're completely remote, is there? So yeah, difficult to dig into that.
So the word that James said, intentional, I think is vital. Being deliberate and intentional is key.
There you go. We need to be intentional about being informal.
My daughter once said, can we plan an impromptu event?
And intentional about the formal stuff as well, right?
Yeah.
It's coming back to feedback. I very often hear the phrase feedback is a gift. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think it's more a duty than a gift. And I think it needs to be done well, and it needs to be done right, and it needs to be done often. I think all too often someone says they've got some feedback for you, and it happens so infrequently you assume that it's got to be bad. I think trying to make it a regular thing so that it becomes a non-event, that it's just something that happens. I think that's something that, again, more so remotely, it needs to be more intentional than just hallway conversations.
And the balance. So the Gottman Institute, which did research on whether marriages would marriages would end in divorce, they recommended 5 to 1 positive intent, and also like turning towards rather than turning away from. But if you're only sharing negative feedback with people, they're not going to be in a place to accept it. So you have to build up that trust again.
Something that I have been told many a time is that no feedback is good feedback. and I've always been.
Oh dear. Sorry, Sarah. I think we've lost you.
Oh, what is going on with my internet?
Oh dear.
You're back.
Sorry.
I'm going to switch to hotspotting off my phone. Sorry if I drop for a second.
No problem.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that's all very true, isn't it? You know, when you're in an office, the informal stuff kind of happens whether you want to or not, whether you want it to or not. You know, you're arriving at the office, you're walking through the kitchen, you're going from meeting to meeting, and these interactions just kind of happen, don't they? You have to be more specific about making sure they happen when you're completely remote. Having said that, there are definitely companies that I've worked with where they just don't do any kind of informal interaction when they're completely remote, and they work. They're not companies I'd want to work in, but in terms of psychological safety, they seem to be on a pretty positive footing because they're all clear up front that that is the way it's going to be. You know, it's not going to be like being in an office or having that. So maybe the question is about being explicit about what kind of culture to expect when you're in these companies. So, you know,
Yeah.
you're not expecting the culture of an in-person office to be picked up and sort of dropped onto a remote one. But yeah.
And is
Yeah,
it experienced by everyone the same? Because, you know, I think when some people are excluded, that is part of the problem. And, you know, when you talk about visibility, if some people are getting opportunities to be made more visible, some are getting sponsorship opportunities, that makes a difference as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I think in particular, you need to take into account like timings with that. You know, if you've got parents who need to go and pick up their kids after school, or if you've got people with health conditions where they can't have a really early morning breakfast, coffee and stuff like that. All of that type of stuff is accommodation, but also it's very easy with big payback. Taking into account, okay, well, I know this person needs to leave at 5 on this day, so we're not going to do the social at 5:30 and exclude them. You know, it's a little bit of setup, but it has a much bigger reward.
Yeah. So one place I worked that for a while had quite significant issues with psychological safety. It was this was a team in South Africa where there are still culturally different views on, you know, racial issues and certain other things that we as a team out here in the UK we knew about them, but I don't think we really appreciated them to their full until things kind of blew up. And things did hit a pretty poor period for a little while. One of the things we did to come back on track was effectively deal with those individual issues, individual differences. We spent a week where I set up an hour every day to go through a specific topic, building towards effectively a team charter and then a set of team APIs for the different teams in the business. So I can't remember exactly how I did it, but it was something like day one, everyone on the team explained how they work best. You know, what is their availability like? What do they actually like random phone calls during the day where they can just talk about random things, or actually do they prefer to be left alone? You know, what is it that they, all the kinds of things that would impact them having a nice time versus them not enjoying working for the company. Then moving on to kind of the things that they didn't like more specifically, or the things that hadn't been working. So facilitating that in a way that allows them to explore the things they're not happy about without offending the people that they're not happy about. Kind of focusing on behaviors rather than traits or individuals. And then kind of feeding up to then the working agreements within the team and trying to define those inter-team APIs. And then sort of I finished off with a session where every team then presented their team's findings, essentially their team APIs, to the other teams. It wasn't an immediate fix by any stretch, but it sort of went that way. Again, coming back to the intentionality of it, it allowed people to realize, I think, that the business and everyone in the company was trying to listen and trying to understand what the problems were, rather than saying, this is how it needs to be, deal with it. Which I think comes back to the point you were saying, Andy, where some companies just don't want anyone to talk to anyone, and everyone who's there is happy with that. And if it is the shared understanding that everyone is happy with that, then that's absolutely fine too. It's about finding your company's context and making sure everyone's happy to work in that way.
Yeah, I'd say so much of that is driven by the personality of the founders as well. So in those particular instances, the founders were quite sort of insular and very execution focused, and so that culture kind of spread to the rest of the company. So I think that's one thing we need to take on board as leaders. We kind of, whether we are conscious of it or not, we kind of drive the culture that we want among our teams. But I wanted to come back to something you were saying, James, about the difference in approach and culture for your team in South Africa. And this is something that I think is fairly unique to remote teams, or has been sort of brought to the fore by us all being now remote teams, these cultural differences, and whether there are different expectations on how people are treated or led or managed based on where they come from. Does anyone have any experience with this, where you've had part of your team in one place that has one set of expectations, and then another part of your team that has another set of expectations, and so on? Anyone want to grab that one?
I'll briefly just touch on the South African. So we had UK, South Africa, and Sri Lanka as a few different teams, and I think that there are cultural differences, and most people, when I went into that situation, my view was, yes, there are cultural differences, but people are still people. But I think that's the wrong point of view to go into geographically distributed teams where there's large cultural differences. So I haven't finished reading it yet, but there's a book that's on my bedside table called The Culture Map.
It's an excellent book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only a couple of chapters in, but even those first couple of chapters highlight some of the big differences that I did discover the painful way, and I wish I had read that before going into that situation. So if you haven't read it, I can strongly recommend picking up a copy of that if you have to deal with cultural differences.
I'm a big fan of that book, actually, and I've brought it into workshops that I've run. And it really, it's Erin Meyer who wrote it, and she's got 8 scales of how, cultural norms that can exist. And yeah, there's personality differences, there's lots of other factors, but it is one thing to think about. And I would have seen it in teams that I led where we had people from the US, we had people from Belarus, and then we'd lots of nationalities based in Ireland. And even how we shared feedback, there's a lot of different things to think about. And really, it's more about having that shared language and making it visible and talking about it. But knowing when you have, it actually hit me. I was presenting something to a CFO, and there was one piece, one of the scales is around how applications first or principles first. And the European model would be, I'm coming in, here's the problem we're trying to solve, here's the background, here's the context, and this is my recommendation. This guy was based in the US, and he was really impatient and agitated as I worked through my slides. And then he said, look, when are you going to get to what you want? So he wanted me to start nearly with your case study or proposal, and didn't want all that background. So I learned that then if I was ever doing a presentation with him, I would change the format. So there's so many good insights in it. I think it's really worth looking at. And also, I know in Ireland, if I gave you feedback, you need to relook at that presentation. It's not really, you know, I think there might be there's few opportunities to improve it. I might really be saying it's terrible, but I'm not going to say those words. But somebody who's Dutch might go, this is absolute crap. So if you say it to somebody from a nationality that would be more direct, if an Irish person gives them feedback, they think they love it, you know. So knowing that is vital in a team.
And I think that that's not just to do with nationality and culture. That's also to do with neurodivergent. Like, totally. If you're on the spectrum, ADHD, I'm very, very much a person that I'm not good with the fluff. I'm not good with reading between the lines. Like, I need you to say it to me straight, but you also know that I will always be straight and honest with you. One thing that I wanted to add, though, with the culture was, one of the times I have not felt psychologically safe, and this was many, many years ago. I was working a lot with a remote team in predominantly in India, but there were 20 people in that team, so I don't know everyone in the team. And I kept getting feedback from my manager at the time saying that they weren't happy with the way I was communicating with them. But what they weren't happy about was that I wasn't using enough smiley faces, and I wasn't using enough emojis in general and exclamation marks. And that when I asked them to do something, or they asked me for help, and then, for example, I'd like SSH'd into a machine to fix it, and then they rebooted the machine. And I was like, well, I can't help you. You've just kicked me off and lost my logs. They weren't happy about that. But when a male colleague of mine used the exact same language, as in we copied and pasted, they said it was fine. And what was really hard about that was that my manager at the time did not try and help bridge that. They did not stand up for me, but also they didn't explain to this other team, like, look, this isn't okay. You know, there's always going to be uncomfortable conversations at times, but they didn't have that. They didn't feel comfortable having that. And therefore I didn't have that psychological safety in my manager. I didn't feel like they would stand up for me. They would protect me. And it comes down to nice v kind, I think. I heard somebody say recently, you can be nice, but not kind. And it was a really interesting thought, because in the context of the conversation, the implication was being nice isn't necessarily authentic, and it isn't necessarily the right thing to do. It's dancing around something. It's not necessarily being honest. It's placating, whereas being kind is being honest, but in an appropriate way. And I think that's so critical for psychological safety, because at the end of the day, these are businesses. It's not, you know, people need to make money. They need to make a profit. Layoffs happen, reorgs happen, change of direction happens. But it's the way that you actually approach that. It's the way you approach and publicly and privately handle different situations and events, if that makes sense.
Totally. And it's like, what are you prepared to put up with? What are you prepared to tolerate? That says a lot. And I think even what you were talking about there, Sarah, you know, it's that feeling that someone has your back. I think that's what psychological safety feels like. You feel that somebody will support you and will challenge on your behalf and be an ally as well, you know, and that's really, really vital. And I love the kind. Brené Brown says clear is kind. And I think, you know, being really clear and transparent is really vital. And in my research, the word that came up the most was transparency.
Yeah. Obviously, the canonical book that we should be recommending here is Radical Candor by, gosh, I've forgotten the author.
Kim Scott.
Kim Scott, thank you very much. I knew it was a Kim. Sorry, Kim. But yeah, worth checking out.
One thing I think as well is that having your back doesn't necessarily always mean that you're going to protect them in a company. It's the idea of person v like cog, right? There are situations where I've had honest conversations with both colleagues or even when I used to be a manager, reports at different times where I've said that you're not performing to what you want to perform at. And it's about actually sometimes the best thing is to move on. It is to go to a different company, to take a break, whatever it is, right? Move to a different team. And actually having your back can also be the honest response of, well, we can't support you in the way you need, or we don't have that growth, or like the opportunity for growth and progression, or actually we can't fit your needs right now. And that's not, there's accommodation, of course, but there's also that understanding of you're a person. I have a lot of health problems. I'm diabetic. I've got everything under the sun. I couldn't be a contractor. I couldn't go and work for a company where I'm going into other businesses and there's a huge time pressure, because I could get sick and be out for a month and then we've lost money or that client has missed a deadline. I know that I can't be a linchpin like that anymore, but I also know that my health wouldn't be able to handle it, and it then wouldn't be fair on the client. And that was a conversation I've had with mentors and people who I feel safe having that discussion with, where they've gone, no, you're right. It would be a disaster. And that was the kind thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is, it sort of ties back to the ability for the other person to listen and to actually hear what you're saying, because it's very easy for, you know, I've been in one-on-ones where I've opened up and I've said something that, you know, I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z, or I need to deal with this, so I'm not going to be at my best for a little while. And you can tell on the other side that they're, you know, maybe they've made a note of it, maybe they've just sort of nodded and they're going to move on with their life. Or you have the ones that, you know, they listen, they take it in, they understand, okay, that's going to impact X, Y, and Z, but, you know, we need to make sure that you're okay. And how do we accommodate what you need now that you've opened up to me and you've felt safe enough to tell me this? I need to now make, as a leader, I need to turn around and make sure that your trust in me isn't invalidated and you don't feel that you can't come to me again with those sorts of things, because, you know, tell me something personal and if I laugh at you, you're never going to tell me that again, right? Or tell me anything else. So that, and then knowing that they're going to handle it. So having evidence that they have handled it. I think, you know, even if they come back to you a week later and say, look, Sarah, I know you told me this. I've gone and I've spoken to a few other people. We can't do anything. We can't help you. I'm sorry. At least then you've got the understanding that, you know, they have listened, they have tried. Business is business. Sometimes we can't accommodate things, but knowing that you've been listened to and that someone, as you said, like allyship, someone who's there for you to try to fight your case, even if they can't win. I think that goes a long way to the rest of the team feeling psychologically safe. If they have evidence that one person has been dealt with well, then, you know, that kind of spreads. It's a good virus.
Yeah, I think the
I
key
think
is
it's active listening. Active listening is something that we're not very good at, especially when you've got 100 billion things that you're trying to juggle at the same time. You didn't put enough time in between meetings, so you kind of need the loop. You know, active listening is a skill that all leaders need to constantly be working on, but also it's that follow through, it's that intent of not giving empty promises, not giving, you know, not saying, oh, look, if you need to chat, let me know whenever, I'll make time. And then they reach out to you and you don't get back to them for a week because you're too busy. And, you know, that's just going to erode that trust. And it's a lot harder to rebuild than it is to start from neutral.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I think what we're talking about here is sponsorship, isn't it? But I think it's also about consistency. You know, some of the situations I've come into where the psychological safety or the, you know, the general morale to kind of redefine it a little bit, was incredibly low was because there were favorites, and there were certain people who had that kind of active listening and sponsorship and support, but it wasn't seen across the whole team. So it was very much an us and them kind of situation.
And sometimes leaders are not aware that they are favoring people. They're oblivious to it. It's a blind spot. I heard a guy speaking at a tech conference years ago where he said he was a senior leader and he opened this breakfast meeting once a month where leaders could bring someone from their teams. And eventually he said, is there no good women on any of the teams? And people were like, what? And he said, not one of you has brought a woman to this breakfast. And none of them had realized. They just had just kind of just brought somebody along and not thought about it. So I think, again, intention, but also noticing, like, and looking to see who's missing, who's not at the table, whose voice isn't being heard. And like one of the things Amy Edmondson recommends for building psychological safety is that all voices are heard and that you create many ways for voices to be heard. So, Sarah, you were talking about neurodiversity. There's different people. Some people think to talk, some people talk to think, some people need time to process things, some are introverts, some won't want to speak up in front of a group. So you need to create multiple channels for people to share what they think.
And I think it's macro v micro. You can't have macro, and what I mean by that is it's top down v bottom up, essentially. We kind of briefly touched on it earlier. You can have trust in your manager, but not in the company. But at least I've personally very rarely seen or heard of examples where people have trust in the company, but not necessarily their immediate manager. People, there's always different times where people don't get on with their managers. It's not the right fit, but your kind of local community, right, within where you work. And that balance is critical, especially if you're going from startup to scale up. When there's 20 people, you don't have that same level of disconnect. But when you're getting to a point that people you don't have that trust in need to know something, or, ultimately your growth is their decision, that is really critical for the psychological safety, for having a high-performing team, but also that you don't get too much churn. If people are constantly churning, they're not going to have that psychological safety. That will then lead to more people churning because nobody wants to stay somewhere where everyone leaves after 6 months, even if the reason people are leaving is because people have historically left, which you can get.
Definitely, yeah.
Andy, I just noticed there's 2 questions there. And one of them, I was quite interested in how do you maintain psychological safety in a more hostile world and work environment? Because, it's kind of leading in from what Sarah was just talking about as well. Like you can create pockets of psychological safety, but it can be hard when it's not coming from the top. And you were talking as well earlier, Andy, about places where the leaders, they set the tone, so it can be hard if the tone is not it does the impact. But I do think that you can create it in small groups, and the ideal is that it's coming from the top. But also mentioned in that question is about like where there's lack of safety in environments like what's happening in the world at the moment, and there's so much of that going on. And I do think that creating space for the humanity is really, really vital, and not staying away from the uncomfortable topics. Checking in with people who may be feeling vulnerable when things are happening. Creating that space for someone to be able to share when something's upsetting them, or having that understanding that you may not be able to show up today because of what's going on in the world is so vital. And like you were talking, James, about business is business, but actually businesses are run by people, and if we don't think about the longer term view, we can lose out. So if we may have some missed deadlines because of something that's happened. I remember when the Ukraine war broke out first, people's lives were in danger. They still are, but people in teams that I was leading, there was real danger to people, and actually creating the space for people to actually be able to live, is vital.
Yeah, I think for me, sorry, Sarah, go for it.
No, you.
I'm going to say for me, it goes even beyond support and kind of providing a calm environment, and being open to letting them spend time away and that sort of thing. It's about advocacy. So the people who are caught in these situations are caught there through no effort of their own, essentially. So being very forthright about how we fight for them as parts of our team, and how we look after them in the wider sense, I think is really important, as well as just making accommodations for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think as well. Oh, sorry.
No, go on, Sarah. You went first.
I think one of the big, not easiest, but often we talk about making space, letting people have space to be vulnerable, but we don't actually say how to do that. And from my experience, the easiest way is to be vulnerable yourself, to be honest, open, to show that you are not, a hardened rock. I'm always very open, regardless of if I'm in a team or leading a team, about my mental health. And that, especially when the Ukraine war broke out and we had people who I worked with and then at one point had a report who at different times were stuck in Ukraine or lived there. And one of the biggest things was, to begin with, everything's up in the air. But as people settle into a slight normal, I'm being very clear with the slight there, you need to actually ask them, how do they want support? I remember a colleague who kind of was like, look, once a week, it'll be good to open up, get stuff off my chest. But the rest of the time, I just want normalcy. I just want to, I want to be able to joke about it. I want to have dark humor. I want to be able to talk about TV, and I want to be able to have a distraction from everything going on around me. And to me, that's the same as being vulnerable. It's being okay with somebody's needs might not be what you would need in that moment. And it might not be what you feel comfortable with, but ultimately, psychological safety is being okay with being uncomfortable and putting, when you can show that you can adapt to people's needs, even if it's not what you feel comfortable doing, they're a lot more likely to actually respect that and bank it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think the only thing I'll really add is, I think situations like Ukraine and various places around the world right now, I guess, really put things into perspective. And I think that I'll say, psychological safety is more kind of a muscle rather than an activity. Is not something you do. It's something you exercise over time, and you build it up, and eventually it's something that hopefully gets strong enough to survive situations like wars and famines and whatever else that the world might throw at you that's completely out of your control. The only caveat, I guess, is, and I hopefully this doesn't come across the wrong way at all, but it's almost easier from a business perspective to practice psychological safety when there is a big world-changing situation, because everybody understands it. And you were saying, Michelle, about deadlines may slip or whatever. It's easier to justify a deadline slipping when there's a war going on than when, I don't know, maybe your child's home from school with a cold. Both of them have an impact on someone's daily lives. One of them is much more broad and one of them is much more focused. I think it can in many ways be harder to accommodate those small issues that people need to deal with on a day-to-day basis than those larger issues that potentially affect the wider society.
And I think, following on from that, I've seen Mark's question about, challenges where person A opens up to person B, where there's trust, but person B needs to communicate it to higher up where there's not that level of trust. Those type of situations, I think, are really relevant to that. I'm going to, from a personal point of view, I've got diagnosed with some bad health problems a couple of years ago. And I was in a time of a lot of change at work, from management to org to my own role and what I wanted to do and all of that. And I had to open up to people I wasn't that comfortable opening up with. On the flip side, I opened up to people I was comfortable opening up with. And the big difference was that I trusted the people I was comfortable opening up with. They would handle it respectfully. They would tell who they needed to tell, but they would only tell what they had to tell. They wouldn't gossip about it. They wouldn't go in and go, oh, well, Sarah's told me X, my whole life story. It would be, Sarah's got health problems. That is all that you need to know right now. And it's that knowing what actually is needed for the business to know, v gossip.
Yeah, just to pick up on the gossip aspect really quickly, especially with remote teams, the fastest way to eliminate all sense of trust is to hear something from the wrong person at the wrong time. Yeah. If someone has spoken about you or said something that relates to you in any way, to someone who it either doesn't pertain to or just doesn't need to know it for whatever reason, and you hear it from them, that's really easy to happen in a remote setup because people don't know who knows what necessarily, and they might just drop a message in Slack, or they might jump on a Teams call and just sort of comment on it as an aside, not realizing that they're not meant to say anything. So again, intentionality goes a long way about who you talk to, who you should not talk to, and being clear about where the information is and where it should or shouldn't spread to. I think is something that's it's a fast track to losing trust and easy to do in remote teams.
Going back to like the seminal research on trust talks about 3 elements: ability, benevolence, and integrity. So, that you trust people because of their competence and capability. You trust that they will do the right thing, but also that they will treat you well, So if you feel like somebody's not acting with integrity with your personal information, that's very difficult to rebuild again. When you've got a trust breach based on integrity, it's very, very hard to rebuild that. And just to follow on Sasha's question there in the middle about after post layoffs, management changes or uncomfortable comments in group settings, like I think people can lose trust because if there's layoffs, it can often mean that they've lost trust in the leaders because the leaders have allowed it get to this situation where they had to lay people off. And layoffs, in my opinion, should be like a really difficult decision to make, and it should be not because you've just missed some figure that you've decided. You really should be looking at every opportunity to not lay people off. But I think often when you're trying to rebuild, and the psychological safety is going to be gone, like when you lay people off, because people are going to be afraid to put their head up. The most common phrase I hear people say is, I'm keeping my head down. I'm staying out of trouble. So, how can you have innovation when people are afraid to lift their heads up? But to rebuild it, you need to start to set a shared vision and be really transparent, give people updates and acknowledge, and give people space as well to process, and knowing that everyone doesn't process everything at the same time in the same speed. Giving people support and having those vulnerable, honest, transparent conversations is one of the things you need to do anyway. And
you have to acknowledge and be okay that people are going to talk. People are going to complain, and people are gonna jump on calls or go out for a walk or whatever, regardless of it remote or not, and be unhappy and make those uncomfortable comments, because that is how people process. And I think that one of the big things with the remote is how you are present being remote. Not everyone likes to have their camera on, but there's nothing worse than when you are going through a hard situation, be that layoffs or be that opening up about stuff going on in your life or an issue with work or whatever. And you can see the person that you're opening up to going through Slack, because you can just see, if they're in glasses and there's reflections, or you just see their eyes kind of going to a different screen, or like it's obvious. And that will chip away as well at psychological safety. I think so much of this is about respect and intention with the vulnerability, because they always say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but it's when you're being deliberate and transparent with those intentions in a way that could be uncomfortable, but leads to trust, and it leads to knowing, okay, I might not hear what I want to hear, but I'm going to hear the truth, or I'm going to hear what I can be told from the truth, because you can't always be fully transparent.
Yeah.
It's
so
and you're then going to get more out of people from it.
Just to tie that back to the kind of rounds of redundancy and those kinds of conversations and situations. So I was in a situation 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, I think it was, where I had to make a large amount of my team redundant, and it's never a nice situation on either side to go through that. Obviously, it's not about me making them redundant; it's about them. But I think one of the things that made it harder was due to kind of contractual issues and certain other constraints around the business. I wasn't allowed to be transparent with them about the the eventual impact and the eventual scale of the redundancies on a one-to-one basis. And it wasn't until it was kind of all over that we were then allowed to openly talk about it. I think you were saying that people are going to talk, people are going to have conversations, and as much as we said, don't talk about this, we knew everyone was going to talk about it. And the thing with remote is, or the difference between remote and in person is, in person, you can usually see those conversations happening, even if it's in an office somewhere off to one side. You see people going in, you see them coming out, you see the looks on their faces. Remotely, you're oblivious to all of it. So I think there is, one of the things we did do afterwards is, we put in office hours calls. We just made sure that there was standing times, places for everyone to openly talk about things and say, look, you can say anything you want in this call. You can say anything about the situation, anything about the company, your fears, worries, expectations, and it will not be held against you. And I think that, I'm sure people still held back. I'm sure there were still other conversations, but I think allowing people to have that space goes some way to trying to rebuild that trust. The following year was tough still. Absolutely. Sure, but
yeah. Sorry to cut in. We've reached 1 o'clock. I feel like we could keep going with this conversation for another couple of hours, but that has been really insightful. Thank you very much for all your contributions, everyone, for the great questions in the audience as well. We'll be back. We're going to be back in another couple of weeks. We are nailing down the topic for that one, but if you have any ideas for topics for community Bytes discussions like this, do drop me a line in Slack. Other than that, I'd just like to say massive thanks to James, Sarah, and Michelle. We are all on Slack. If you'd like to drop us any questions or follow-ups after this, we'd love to chat with you. But other than that, we will see you very soon.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
See you later.